Hi, my name is Seth Goldwasser. I am a PhD student at the University of Pittsburgh, and I am submitting a video to the online symposium for the Values in Medicine, Science, and Technology conference at UT Dallas. So the talk is called "The Cure is Worse Than the Disease" on the concepts of health and disability. And I will go ahead and get started. So what difference is there, if any, between cautioning pregnant people against drinking alcohol to excess and cautioning prospective parents against selecting potential offspring that will develop a disability like deafness or Down syndrome? According to some self-avowed eugenicists, there's none. It's permissible to use genetic counseling or genetic enhancement to select or treat potential offspring, provided doing so doesn't decrease the offspring's chance of a good life or interfere with others' well-being. The purpose of this talk is to argue that blanket approval of the use of genetic counseling and genetic enhancement begs the question. Specifically, it begs the question in cases of disability, wherein eugenicists commit themselves to a view of human function or ability, and thereby what constitutes limits or deficits therein. But available accounts of human function that eugenicists can appeal to are determined for several disabilities, whether those disabilities limit or decrease human function or ability at all. In which case, these disabilities, including disabilities like deafness or Down syndrome, might constitute other ways of being human. We might fail to recognize this because the concepts of health and disease we inherit from ableist traditions in medicine impact our concept of disability, in which case there are morally relevant differences between some uses of genetic counseling and others, or genetic enhancement that go unaccounted for. And these unaccounted for differences problematize blanket approval by eugenicists. So here's the structure of the talk. First, I'm going to give an argument on behalf of the eugenicists for genetic counseling, one which I think extends to the use of genetic enhancement. Then I'm going to consider naturalist and hybrid accounts of health, mostly based on the concept of function. Then I'm going to show how these arguments or these accounts underdetermine limits on function or ability in a way that undermines the argument for the use of genetic counseling. And then I'm going to conclude with a comment on what this means for the abortion debate and also relate my view to Elizabeth Barnes. So first, I understand genetic counseling to be a broad set of practices involving two steps. First, genetic counselors use a variety of diagnostic tools to detect or infer genetic diseases and disorders, as well as abnormalities that might predict birth defects. In the second step, genetic counselors attempt to help individuals come to decisions on, for instance, whether to carry a pregnancy to term or undergo a fetal procedure. So as a prelude, I think the harm against disabled people comes in with normative judgments concerning the limits on well-being that are imposed on disabled individuals by their being disabled. Okay, so here's an argument that I take it eugenicists will agree to for the use of genetic counseling. So there are three things worth noting about this argument. First, like some eugenicists, I remain neutral on theories of well-being. The argument applies whether we're committed to maximizing the experience of pleasure in the absence of pain, the satisfaction of desires, or the engagement of activities that are objectively good for us. Second, by quote, expected total well-being in the first and second premises, I mean the balance of well-being, essentially, whichever account of well-being that ends up being true. The third thing to note is that the relevant sphere of causal influence isn't made explicit by, quote, those who may be harmed by that offspring. However, I take it that at minimum, the well-being of caretakers and of those the offspring will form a local community with matters when deciding to use genetic counseling. So at least in terms of the immediate community, there's a minimal degree of influence, and that's all I really need. So some eugenicists think that their focus on enhancement towards a good life in general or all-purpose goods helps them avoid issues of health, disease, and disability. Still, they're committed to the claim that a person or those around that person lead better lives if that person isn't hampered by an in principle preventable or treatable state that, in virtue of its properties, unnecessarily limits or decreases well-being. And eugenicists think it obvious that most disabilities are exactly these kinds of limitations. All right, so with that out of the way, we'll go on to the accounts of function, accounts of health. So pathology and health are interdependent. Both within and outside of medicine and bioethics, we understand pathology usually as a loss of health and health as an absence of pathology, at least if we're using the negative conception of health. The two most prominent naturalist accounts suggest that the concepts of pathology and health are connected by the concept of function, specifically the presence or absence of possibly harmful dysfunctional or harmful functional deficits. Eugenicists must appeal to these accounts, naturalist or hybrid. So naturalist accounts hold that health and pathology are supervene on biological facts. Hybrid accounts hold that they at least partially do. By contrast, non-naturalist accounts, often called normativist accounts, hold that health and pathology supervene on judgments that some state is a good or bad state to be in, respectively. By claiming that certain states internal to the organism unnecessarily limit or decrease well-being by imposing limits on or deficits in function or ability, eugenicists commit themselves to the reality of these limits or deficits, irrespective of judgment. This precludes their being able to appeal to normativist accounts of health. So I'm going to cover the two main naturalist and hybrid accounts of health and show that they do not support, sorry about this, they do not support the argument for the use of genetic counseling. So first I want to consider Christopher Bors's biostatistical account. According to Bors's account, health is the absence of pathology, and pathology is any limit on or deficit in species-typical functioning of any part of an organism. Species-typical functions are those activities of parts of organisms which, if they do anything at all, contribute to the survival or reproduction of individual members of the species. So, for example, the heart has the function to pump blood because it's doing so, if it does anything at all, contributes to the survival or reproduction of individual human beings, and because it's doing so by pumping, including at the rate at which it does this, and when, is statistically typical for human beings. So Bors's view has a couple of persistent problems. The first I have on the slide, but I'm not necessarily going to concern myself with. The second is the one that I'm more concerned with, and this is the requirement of a reference class. So Bors's view requires specifying a reference class in order to get the judgment of what counts as a typical contribution. So we can't determine what's typical for an individual without some class with which to compare that individual. So I so far assumed a species as a reference class, but this assumption won't take us very far. Species concepts are notoriously difficult to define, and Bors himself qualifies his view to capture relevant differences within species, including sexual polymorphism and distinct life stages. Bors never gives a principled justification for this restriction to interspecies reference classes, and this, combined with his commitment to a fully naturalist account of health, leaves open whether states like deafness or Down syndrome should be thought of as pathological or as constituting distinct reference classes. In the latter case, these disabilities may not be pathological at all. So the second account is Jerome Wakefield's harmful dysfunction account. According to it, health is the absence of pathology, and pathology is a deficit and function that's harmful to the organism. Functions are in turn defined as those activities of parts of organisms that contributed to the survival or reproduction of ancestors of those organisms, such that the relevant parts were selected for by natural selection. So again, the function of the heart is to pump blood because pumping blood contributed to past survival or reproduction, such that the heart was selected for. So Wakefield combines a fully naturalist etiological account of function with a normative condition stating that the dysfunction in question must be harmful. This means that Wakefield's account avoids the counterintuitive conclusion that sort of plagues Bors's account, the first problem, that I didn't get, that I'm not getting into. But his account still has a similar problem to Bors's reference class problem. So more specifically, etiological accounts don't state exactly how far in the past a part must be selected for in order for its activity to count as a function. One proponent of the etiological account, Karen Neander, suggests that we can often ascribe a normal function just after a few generations, right? We just need to sort of find the ancestors of the current organisms and draw a uninterrupted line in which selection pressures are actively enforced, and the response then is for the part to do what it does. So importantly, selection pressures are features of extrinsic to organisms that contribute to the differential inheritance of some traits over others. So, and selection pressures may be at least partially socially determined. A classic case is the inability to digest lactose, so after infancy. So there were a couple of communities in our past which through domestication practices relieved the sort of selection pressure against digesting lactose after infancy. And because of that, people from those communities who are lactose intolerant can count as dysfunctional, whereas the rest of us who are lactose intolerant do not. Analogously, assuming once present selection pressures are absent for long enough, some disabilities will cease being pathological on etiological-based accounts of health. One benefit of the amount of niche construction we can engage in as humans is that the world can be made to require less of the sort of activities that are disabling to disabled individuals. If so, then we might have a duty to relieve those selection pressures rather than try to rectify the disability by intervening on the person. So with both naturalistic accounts of health in play, I'm now going to try to say what's wrong with the argument for genetic counseling. So again, I think this argument would extend to genetic enhancement. We just sort of have to replace genetic enhancement in the premises and conclusion. So I highlight premises 2 and 3 where I think the arguments go wrong. So we've seen that on the naturalist and hybrid accounts of health, disabilities may fail to count as pathologies. This is because some such disabilities may constitute their own reference classes, or it might be because we relieve the selection pressures. So because Bors doesn't give a principled reason for reference class restriction, there's no reason against counting deaf people or those with Down syndrome as their own reference classes. On etiological-based accounts, disabilities count as pathologies only if the relevant selection pressures continue to select for the relevant able-bodied trait or activity. So it doesn't follow on these accounts that it's permissible to engage in genetic counseling when relieving those selection pressures is available to us. So given that these considerations threaten premises 2 and 3, it may turn out that expected total well-being is always limited or decreased more by failures to recognize some disabled communities as constituting their own reference classes, or by failures to construct more disability-friendly environments, relieving the relevant selection pressures. So in that case, I just don't think that the permissibility of genetic counseling follows from these premises. There's a way to block this argument. But you might wonder why think that these disabilities are pathologies. And why does it matter if the eugenicist doesn't really care to be addressing pathology in particular? Well, in answer to the first question, I think that you only think that this argument follows if you are sort of already thinking that disabilities are continuous with pathologies. You just have to assume as much. And if you look at people like Singer in particular, he will just say as much. But if you look at conceptions of health as like philosophically argued from a naturalistic perspective, it just doesn't follow on those accounts that disability is continuous with pathology. And the second sort of answer, or the answer to the second question, is that the eugenicist thinks that the enhancements in the non-pathological cases are just victimless crimes, right? And if I give you X-ray vision, you benefit, no one's harmed, right? If it's a crime, it's a victimless crime. And they think similarly, if I give you hearing, where once you were deaf, this is a non-issue because if it's a crime, it's a victimless crime. But of course, you have to think that these sort of interventions are ones in which people just stand to benefit. And it's not clear that that's the case. And in particular, the arguments that I've provided as evidence that the naturalistic accounts of health don't justify this inference. I think this opens a possibility that, in fact, we stand to do more harm by engaging in such interventions than good. So I include as well this slide where I think when we open up this space, something that follows, something that might follow, right, is that these communities count as being human in a different way, right? And so without presuming the continuity between disability and pathology, we should reckon with the possibility, and what I think is a fact, that we shouldn't be applying the norms of health specific to able-bodied people to disabled people, and that this is sort of where the harm begins. And it is both in the eugenicists' sort of arguments, and it's sort of all over the place in medical practice as well. So before concluding, I just want to say a couple things. One is that I don't think that my argument I don't think it follows from my argument that we should restrict access to abortion, especially, in light of recent, very much historical events in the US. I think quite the opposite. It's a medical procedure and people need access to it, and the state has a duty to provide that access. What I will say is that the moral failing is one in which the doctor or parents go in for that procedure on the basis of eugenics type judgments, namely that you are doing the medical procedure because you think the life of the of your disabled, of what will become your disabled child would be, it's not worth living, right? It's pitiable, it's to be avoided at all costs, et cetera, right? If that's the sort of thing that's grounding your judgment, then I think that's sort of a moral failing in terms of your judgment. I still think that the state has a duty to give access to abortion. The last thing is how my view contributes to the discussion. So I think it does so in a pretty straightforward way. So Elizabeth Barnes's mere difference view is one in which my view sort of sits nicely as friendly. However, my view differs from her value neutral model by sort of claiming that disabilities might not constitute limitations or decreases in normal function, and therefore may not be limitations on the disabled person's abilities to do, on their well-being, right? So I think that for Elizabeth Barnes's view, she is willing to say that disability is continuous with pathology, and my view differs from hers by allowing the proponent of disability rights to say that in fact disability is not continuous with pathology. All right. So that's my talk, and thank you very much. Please, if you have any questions, comments, shoot me an email. My email is SEG, S as in Sam, E as in Eagle, G as in Gold, 111 @pitt.edu. And thank you so much for your time.